Under the bright California sun, the gorilla enclosure at the San Diego Wildlife Conservatory pulsed with noise. Tourists chattering, children tapping the glass, guides explaining dominance hierarchies and feeding routines. But in the farthest shadowed corner of the habitat, untouched by light or attention, sat a creature almost no one ever noticed. His name was George. Though most visitors never heard it, they were too busy pointing at the silverback who beat his chest or the excitable juvenile who swung across ropes and platforms. But George was different. He didn't roar. He didn't perform. He didn't even seem to exist except as a silent shape carved out of darkness. To most guests, he was just a rock, an unmoving silhouette, a piece of the habitat decor. Days passed where not a single real figure in the corner was alive. Even the keepers who monitored daily feeding and health logs spoke of him with puzzled resignation. The quiet one, the shadow, the one who feels like he's not really here. No aggression, no distress, no illness, just an eerie stillness, a presence without presence. George ate when food was out. He drank when water appeared. But beyond those basic responses, he didn't join the troop. Didn't engage with enrichment tools. Didn't respond to calls or gestures. If someone tossed up toward him, it might roll off his foot without so much as a glance. If another gorilla approached, George simply shifted his weight or turned slightly, neither welcoming nor rejecting the interaction. He was a ghost that breathed. What unsettled the staff most wasn't his silence. It was the feeling impossible to explain that he was holding something back. Something enormous, something hidden, that sense lingered in the air around him like an unfinished sentence no one could read. Some keepers believed he lacked stimulation. Others thought he'd been traumatized before arriving. But none of them could pinpoint what made George feel so strange, so unreachable, so profoundly alone. His stillness wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, heavy, waiting for something no one else could perceive. Veterinarians examined him repeatedly over the years. No physical injuries, no neurological abnormalities, no disease. His vitals were strong. His reflexes were intact. His muscles under that mass of dark fur remained powerful and well-developed, something that confused the team because he barely moved enough to maintain that strength. His health was perfect, his spirit unreadable. It was as if his body lived in this conservatory, but his mind remained somewhere far away. Visitors occasionally noticed him by accident. A child pointing, "Mom, is that one sleeping?" A teen squinting. "Wait, is that a gorilla?" But then their attention drifted back, louder, more theatrical animals. George faded into the background again, the forgotten inhabitant of a busy world. Even the signage near the enclosure didn't feature his portrait. His life was a blank spot. And yet, to the few who paid close attention, something about him felt wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, just inexplicably out of place. Like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong picture. Elena, one of the senior keepers, often found herself lingering outside his corner long after her shift ended. "What are you doing in there?" she whispered once, watching his unmoving form. "What are you waiting for?" He didn't look up, didn't twitch, but she swore just once, his fingers curled subtly, as if it hurt her, and chosen not to answer. New staff found him unsettling. Volunteers avoided that corner after sundown. Night crews reported that even when he slept, George seemed to wear his breathing too deliberate, his posture almost too controlled. They would shine their flashlights through the glass during rounds, expecting to catch him sprawled like the others. Instead, they always found him sitting rigid, eyes open, staring into a darkness only he seemed to recognize. Some nights, motion sensors in the enclosure would flicker with brief alerts, small movements in George's corner. But whenever the cameras checked, still his back turned, as if freezing the instant he suspected someone might be watching. At first, staff chalked it up to glitches. Old wiring, a moth, the occasional leaf blown by the night breeze. But the alerts kept happening, always at strange hours, always near George, always gone before anyone could catch them. It was the kind of pattern people dismissed until it formed. A rhythm too perfect to ignore. Something else added to the mystery. Every January, like clockwork, George grew restless for 1 week. Not visibly. He didn't pace or cry out, but his breathing grew heavier, his gaze sharpened, and the keepers always found him sitting closer to the viewing glass as if waiting for someone who never arrived. When the week passed, he returned to his motionless existence. The zoo's primate team kept records of every animal's origins, but George's past was frustratingly fragmented. He had transferred from an overseas facility that no longer existed. The documents were incomplete, missing entire years of his life. The trainers who once worked with him had disappeared into retirement or other continents. A few notes remained. Unusual social behavior. Responds inconsistently to stimuli. Avoids conflict. Possible trauma history. None of it explained the quiet ache that seemed to radiate from him. A loneliness so thick it felt like fog. On paper, George was simple. In reality, he was a locked room. But the truth about him, why he said so, why his eyes held that lost, distant darkness was about to break open in the most unexpected way. It wouldn't happen during feeding hours or enrichment exercises. It wouldn't happen under the bright California sun at all. It would happen when the world went silent. When the crowds were gone. When the lights were off. When George believed he was alone. And what the night cameras captured next would shatter everything the zoo thought it knew about him. Everything the world believed about gorillas. And reveal a secret no one was prepared to face. At 3:12 a.m., the San Diego Wildlife Conservatory felt like a different world. No laughter, no tour guides, no clatter of strollers rolling across concrete. Just the hum of distant filtration pumps, the pulse of security lights, and the low whisper of wind slipping across empty walkways. The zoo slept. Everything slept except George. The new motion-activated infrared system had been installed only a week earlier after a string of petty overnight break-ins left frustrated and uneasy. Most enclosures showed nothing but the predictable stillness of animals deep in their night rhythms. Keepers expected the same monotony from George's feed, perhaps even more predictable than the others considering his statue-like nature. But at 3:12 a.m., a small red alert flashed on the corner of the security monitor. Movement detected Gorilla Sector C4. The night guard on duty, a young technician named Harris, frowned. No one ever saw activity in C4. Curiosity tugged at him. He clicked the alert and froze. George T. sitting in his usual shadowed corner. He was standing, not shifting, not stretching. Standing with a sense of purpose like someone awakening from years of self-imposed sleep. The stark, greenish glow of the infrared cast his massive frame and smooth outlines. Highlight muscles that rarely moved in daylight. But it wasn't his posture that made Harris sit bolt upright. It was the rhythm. George wasn't teeping. He wasn't agitated. His arms lifted slowly, almost delicately, as if feeling the air. His shoulders swayed left then right, a slow, hypnotic motion. The movement was too smooth, too measured, nothing like the chaotic agitation of a distressed animal. He was dancing. Harris blinked hard, convinced he had misinterpreted the footage. He scrubbed backward, replayed the same motion, then forward again, the same sway. George turned one deliberate pivot, placing one knuckle lightly to the ground before lifting it again. Not random, not instinctive, something else. On the screen, George tapped the glass. 3 soft, rhythmic taps, evenly spaced. Tap, tap, tap. Harris felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. No gorilla moved like that. No animal moved like that. The taps were too controlled, too reminiscent of a beat. He waited for George to stop to retreat into stillness, but the gorilla continued lifting his arms in a manner that almost resembled remembering rather than performing. It lasted 11 minutes. 11 long, impossible minutes. By the time morning staff arrived, Harris had already replayed the footage 18 times. He tried to explain the moment to Elena when she walked in, but every word sounded ridiculous, like a dream he was trying to convert into logical sentences. "You need to see this," he finally insisted, dragging her to the monitor. The second she hit play, her breath caught. Her hands gripped the back of the chair. Her lips parted, not in confusion, but in recognition. Not recognition of George, recognition of the movement. She watched the sway, the turn, the tap, and whispered, "No, it can't be." Other keepers gathered as she replayed the footage. Their conversations fell into stunned silence. Some leaned closer to the screen, searching for signs of distress. Butko wasn't distressed. He looked connected to something invisible. "This isn't random," one keeper murmured. "It's intentional," said another. "No," Elena said softly. "It's memory." The footage spread eternally within hours. Department heads watched it. Veterinarians watched it. No one spoke. No one breathed because suddenly the ghost-like stillness George showed during the day wasn't silence at all. It was suppression, and his movement at night wasn't inhabitant. It was a ritual, a memory, a plea, a secret trying to break free. Elena was the first to speak, her voice barely more than a trembling whisper. I've seen this before. Everyone turned to her. She swallowed hard eyes on the footage years ago in a traveling circus near Bucharest. A juvenile gorilla, skinny, terrified, trained to imitate humans, clap on command, spin on command, wave on command, dance on command. A chill swept across the room. You don't think someone began? Elenina nodded slowly. I think George remembers things we never knew he lived through. And suddenly, the footage wasn't strange anymore. It was tragic. George had never been silent. He had been hiding. He had never been still. He had been waiting. He had never been disengaged. He had been protecting himself from a world that had once demanded performance and stays. The cameras had not captured something impossible. They had captured a truth no one had been prepared to see. A gorilla dancing with the ghost of his past. A soul replaying the only language he once knew. A being who had been invisible for years, suddenly illuminated by moonlight and memory. And the world, his world, was about to change forever. George's secret, the movement he had hidden for years, spread through the staff like a quiet shockwave. But while some keepers whispered theories and tried to make sense of the impossible footage, Elenina felt something different twisting inside her. A heaviness, a familiarity, a memory she wished she could forget. She knew exactly what she had seen in George's movements, not because of textbooks or behavioral studies, but because she had once watched a gorilla perform those same motions under blinding spotlights and human laughter. George wasn't just dancing. He was remembering the life he had survived. In the staff conference room, the atmosphere was tense as the primate team reviewed every scrap of information in George's file. The director projected his intake report on the wall confiscated from an illegal traveling circus in Eastern Europe. Severely underweight, minimal socialization with other gorillas, exhibited abnormal repetitive behaviors, estimated 2 years old at time of rescue. Most on the team had never questioned those lines. They assumed George's silence, his stillness, his refusal to engage were symptoms of early trauma. Nothing more. But Elenina shook her head. It wasn't just trauma, she said quietly. It was training, conditioning, a life built around performance. The room fell silent as she began to speak, not as a keeper, but as a witness to George's unspoken past. She had been 19, working part-time with a conservation group that assisted in animal seizures across Romania and Hungary. She remembered the call that came in a small circus raided for violating animal welfare laws, tigers in cramped cages, a bear chained to a pole, and a single young gorilla wide-eyed, thin trembling, locked behind metal bars painted in garish circus colors. When we approached, Elena whispered, he flinched at every movement. But the moment one of the officers lifted a baton, he lifted his arms and clapped. Once, twice, perfect rhythm, trying to please someone who wasn't even there. Gas rippled across the room. That little gorilla, she continued, voice tight, looked just like George. They checked old transport logs. The timeline matched. George, the circus gorilla. The child, forced to mimic humans for applause. Elenina's voice wavered. He wasn't being cute or playful. He was following orders burned into his memory. Dancing meant attention. Dancing food. Dancing meant they would stop shouting. The footage of George's midnight movements suddenly became heavier, heartbreaking in its clarity. The quiet sways, the gentle spins, the soft taps on the glass. All of the mirrored routines Elenina had seen in that dark circus tent. Movements performed out of fear, then repeated out of memory. Now someone whispered, he wasn't doing it for us. No, Elena said he was doing it for the boy. He used to be the one who learned that motion was survival. The director leaned forward. We need confirmation. Pull international records. Elena said, look for the circus named Circo Celestia. They're finding fragments of its history. A traveling show known for exploiting exotic animals, frequently relocating to evade authorities. One grain paper photo made the room collectively inhale. A small gorilla wearing a sequin vest stood on a wooden platform, arms raised mid-spin. Beside him, a trainer held a baton. The director zoomed the photo. The gorilla's eyes, large, dark, frightened, matched George's perfectly. The realization settled like dust in the air. George hadn't been a ghost because he was empty. He had been a ghost because performing had once been the only way he knew how to exist. And when applause vanished, he vanished with it. What no one expected was how deeply this discovery would impact the team. Keepers who had once joked of Stillness now watched him with heartbreak instead of confusion. Researchers combed through hours of footage mapping patterns that revealed not chaos but deliberate choreography. Volunteers began reading about trauma behaviors in primates, trying to understand the psychology behind learned performance. And Elena, who had thought she'd long buried her memories of that rescued baby gorilla, found herself awake at night, remembering the way he had reached through the cage bars. Not for food, not for toys, for a hand. He had been so desperate to be seen. In the days after revelation, George's behavior remained unchanged during daylight. He sat in his corner, eyes half-lit, unmoving, unresponsive. Visitors passed without a second glance. Children complained he was boring. Parents tapped the glass, trying to provoke question, unaware that George's stillness was a shield he'd spent years constructing. But at night, the cameras told a different story. He swayed with old shadows. He clapped for absent crowds. He turned in slow circles like replaying scenes from a life he had never truly escaped. One clip nearly broke the staff. Just before dawn, George approached the glass and lifted one arm in a slow, unmistakable gesture. A wave. The same wave from the circus photo. The same wave he had once given audiences who cheered without understanding what it cost him. Only this time, no one was there to wave back. Ella Lenina covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. He still thinks someone is coming. Someone asked softly, coming for what? To tell him he did good enough. Silence swallowed the room. The team had tried for years to integrate George with the troupe, but the other gorillas never knew what to make of him. He didn't play. He didn't challenge. He didn't show curiosity. He didn't even respond to aggression. He simply sat an animal built for strength, living as a shadow. Now, for the first time, they understood why. George hadn't been disconnected. He had been waiting for sound, for music, for a cue, for permission to exist again. And beneath all of it, beneath the stillness, beneath the silence, was a question no one dared speak aloud. If George had spent years hiding his true self during the day, what would happen if they finally gave him a reason to step into the light? The first evening they tried music, the primate building felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The zoo had closed 2 hours earlier, the public long gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of popcorn and the distant hum of filtration pumps. Ella Lenina stood in the observation room with a handful of keepers and researchers, her palms damp, her pulse uneven. They had prepared for this moment with the care of people handling something fragile, sacred, and easily broken. A single speaker sat near the glass, small enough not to draw attention, but positioned where its sound would reach the enclosure without overwhelming it. They had debated for hours about what kind of music to try, something gentle, something slow, something far removed from the booming circus tracks that once dictated George's life. In the end, Elena chose a soft jazz piece, low saxophone, warm, brushed snare, melody without sharpness, a rhythm without command, a song without expectations. At first, nothing happened. George was exactly where they expected him to be, curled into his shadowed corner legs, folded head down, an unmoving silhouette carved from silence. The sight of him still made something inside Elena ache. Now that she knew the truth of his history, his stillness was no longer a mystery, but a wound. The music began at the lowest volume, so faint it was almost indistinguishable from air. The notes drifted across the enclosure like cautious visitors, unsure whether they were welcome. The team remained motionless. Finally, George stirred. Not dramatically, not with the trained snap of attention a circus cue once demanded. It was subtle, a shift of his shoulder, a slow lift of his head, a barely perceptible tension in his spine. His eyes opened, not wide, but enough for their dark shine to catch the faint light. He didn't look toward the speaker. He looked toward the glass, toward the room where the human stood, toward Elena. She felt an unexpected sting of tears. More seconds passed. Then George rose. He did not lumber forward like a wild gorilla might. He didn't approach with fear or aggression. His movements were measured, deliberate, the motions of someone stepping into something half remembered and half feared. He walked toward the center of the enclosure, stopped, and stood utterly still. The saxophone breathed out a slow, lingering note. And George answered. A sound began in his chest, low, soft, vibrating like the hum of a distant drum. Not a growl, not a warning, a hum. A tone held with surprising control, matching the rhythm with uncanny precision. The keeper stiffened, one covered her mouth. A researcher whispered, "Oh my God." But George continued humming perfectly in time, his voice blending with the music as if he had been waiting for it. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, something had changed. His posture softened. The rigid tension that had defined him for years loosened. His arms hung naturally at his sides. He tilted his head intimately to the beat. Then he moved. The first sway was small, just a shift of weight, a gentle roll of one shoulder. The next was bigger, a slow side motion, like a leaf learning how to move with the wind. His arms lifted slightly awkward, as though he was reacquainting himself with limbs he once used for expression rather than survival. Evelynina's breath caught. It was the same rhythm from the videos, the same choreography he performed in darkness. But now it was different. Nothing forced, nothing hidden, not stolen from old routines carved by fear. This movement was chosen, not commanded. The music swelled, and George stepped forward. Not a full dance step, a soft pivot, then another half-turn. His foot tapped once, then again, almost shyly. He brought one hand to the glass and tapped 3 times, perfectly synchronized with the beat. Tap, tap, tap. Someone behind Elena let out a sob. This was not a ghost moving. This was someone coming back to life. George lowered his hands, slowly breathed deeply, and for the first time since arriving at the zoo, looked at the humans watching him, not with fear, not with confusion, but with recognition. The music faded, but George didn't. He remained standing, breathing steadily, eyes locked on Elena as if waiting for something. Not a command, not an order, a response. Elena lifted her hand palm open and very gently tapped glass twice. George blinked, then tapped back. Same rhythm, same softness. The room fell silent, but the silence felt full of something fragile and new, something growing in space between them. Trust. On the second, it happened faster. The moment the saxophone began, George rose from the shadows, approached the glass, and hummed stronger, now more confident. He lifted his arms in a slow arc as if conducting the melody, and when Elena mirrored the motion, he paused, then repeated it. He wasn't performing, he was communicating, a language without words, a conversation built on rhythm and memory, a bridge forming between trauma and healing. By the 5th night, the transformation was undeniable. George no longer hid in the corner at closing time. Instead, he waited, sitting near the front of the enclosure, posture, relaxed gaze, searching the empty room, long before the staff arrived. When the music began, he stood immediately, humming in anticipation, moving with a fluidity none of them had ever seen in him. He was still quiet, still gentle, still reserved. He was no longer invisible. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his entire life, Ka was not dancing for applause, fear, or survival. He was dancing because the music had found him, because someone finally saw him, because he was learning slowly, painfully, beautifully what it felt like to belong. When the sanctuary finally opened its gates to accept George, the air itself felt different, cleaner, softer, more honest than any place he had known in years. No painted backdrops trying to mimic forest, no artificial vines, no crowds pressing their hands against glass. Just an open-air habitat stretching into a real woodland edge where tall pines whispered in the wind and sunlight fit through leaves instead of skylights. Under the open sky with real beneath him and another soul at his side, George danced again, slow, gentle, free. And for the first time in his life, his dance belonged only to him. In the end, George's story is not simply about a gorilla who danced in the dark. It is a story about what happens when a living being, any living being, is finally seen. Not washed, not observed through glass, not judged or misunderstood, but truly seen. For years, George lived hidden in plain sight, a quiet shadow in a zoo full of noisy distractions. Visitors thought he was dull, uninterested, unreachable. Even staff who cared deeply could never quite decipher the silence he carried like a second skin. But silence is rarely emptiness. More often it is a language shaped by memories too heavy to name. What the world discovered slowly and painfully was that George's stillness had been the armor built to survive a past no animal should ever endure. The circus lights, the voices, first claps, the pain behind every performance. These were not just memories. They were scars. And like so many beings who have been hurt before, George learned that the safest way to exist was to become invisible. Yet even in that invisibility, he kept a flicker of something alive. A rhythm, a heartbeat, a movement he saved for the moments when the world was quiet enough to let him breathe. His dance was never about entertainment. It was a memory of who he used to be. And the sanctuary became the place where memory transformed into healing. When George stepped onto real earth for the first time, touching the ground instead of concrete, something ancient awakened in him. A recognition of the life he went to live. The wind brushing across his hand, the scent of pine, the vastness of the sky above him. All of it connected him to a truth he had never forgotten, even through years of silence. He was born for freedom, and as he danced under the open sky, no lights, no audience, no commands, that freedom took shape. Not with grand gestures, but with quiet, deliberate movement. When Tama hummed her first greeting, when George hummed back, when they danced side by side beneath moonlight, the world witnessed something rare. The moment healing becomes relational. The moment connection becomes possible again. The moment a traumatized soul realizes it no longer has to hide. George didn't heal because people forced him to adapt. He healed because people finally stepped back and gave him space to grow. He healed because someone paid attention. Because someone finally asked what happened to him instead of simply assuming nothing was wrong. In that transformation lies a lesson for all of us. Too often we move past those who seem quiet, distant, withdrawn. We label them cold, uninterested, unreachable, never realizing how much courage it takes to exist with invisible wounds. George reminds us that silence can carry entire histories, that patience and empathy can unlock what fear has buried, that compassion works not by pushing, but by offering refuge. He reminds us healing is not loud. It is steady, gentle, intentional, and that reclaiming oneself after trauma, after pain, after being unseen is a dance worth honoring. And perhaps most importantly, George teaches us that visibility is a gift, not the kind that comes from crowds or applause, but the kind that comes from real connection. When Tama joined him, first at a distance, then at his side, a new chapter began. Two survivors, no longer alone, finding a shared language and movement, sound, and presence. Their dance was not for the world. It was for themselves, for their freedom, for their right to exist without fear. And yet, even from afar, the world learned from it. We saw changes possible. We saw that healing can happen. We saw that even quieted lives can carry truths powerful enough to shake us. George's journey is a reminder that every living being, human or animal, deserves safety, dignity, patience, and understanding. And that when we offer these things, the results can be extraordinary. If this story touched, or moved you, or opened your eyes in any way, I ask you to support this channel. Your subscription helps us continue sharing emotional, meaningful, life-changing animal stories. Stories that remind us of compassion, resilience, and the hidden beauty in the world. Please subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support gives us the motivation to keep bringing you stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us all that healing is possible. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. And remember, sometimes the quietest beings have the most powerful stories too.